For our midterm project, we decided to make a PowerPoint about the life of the Buddha.
The Buddha had many great deeds, but there are 12 most important and famous deeds. The first deed is known as the descent from Tushita. The Buddha taught in Tushita, which is a realm where the gods live. The Buddha considered 5 things that led him to leave Tushita, which were basically about where he would end up in our world by the factors of the caste system, time, family, and more. Leaving Tushita can be seen as a special event and a sacrifice. It was intended to show everyone that somebody who has achieved enlightenment has control over anything he or she does. I personally think this act is courageous. If I already had a life in a different realm where everything was okay and I had to basically plan out my entire life, I would think that is very stressful. For example, one could somehow compare this to moving somewhere else and planning out their job, housing situation, whether to get a car or not, and how long they're planning to live there for. Another example could be an entrepreneur who risks everything by working at a startup and ends up quitting his or her stable job. These situations don't really have a stable end result, but they can be seen as sacrifices in order for a better living. My question that I have is, do these risky situations tend to accomplish the intentions we put forth when beginning the journey? The second deed was about the Buddha entering his mother's womb. His mom was Queen Maya Devi. The real question is, why didn't the Buddha just descend from the sky or just be born into the world? The Buddha wanted to be seen as normal and decided that he should enter the womb so that even ordinary humans can achieve enlightenment. I think the idea of trying to be as normal as possible and being on the same level as people is relatable, because some may think that others have an advantage over something they don't have. For example, men and women can have the same status for a job, but women tend to be less assertive in workplace environments because they don't want to receive negative consequences. The third deed was taking birth. He was born in the garden of Lumbini on a full moon day. Around the same time, there was a lot of things happening. For example, flowers, trees, and crops were growing and blossoming everywhere. A full moon day for Buddhists is very important because it signifies the birth and death of the Buddha. I think this was interesting because I'm personally a Muslim, and Fridays are very important for us because Muslims gather together to pray together. A question that I have is that, are there any other significant days for Buddhists? The fourth deed was when the Buddha became skilled in the arts, crafts, and sciences. The Buddha worked at becoming a scholar and became skilled in many different activities. He wanted to show that it's necessary to receive education in the culture we're born into. Why was this act such a big part of the Buddha's life? For example, a computer scientist would need the necessary skills in order to become a skilled programmer. While those skills would be necessary to succeed in that field, it is also important to learn other things. While you would need to know how to code, it is also important to know basic human interaction and problem-solving skills. I personally think that this is a good idea because having a variety of skills can allow you to pursue more than one passion, and you're more open to things that are put in front of you.
So the next deed for us to talk about is the fifth, which is delighting in the company of royal consort. And so we discussed this topic in class a little bit about how the prince was married and then had a son. In the palace, he was really protected from the realities of life, and his father feared he might leave. So the main reflection that I've had about this is whether material possessions bring us happiness or whether they weigh us down somewhat. And I think that the answer is pretty complex, and maybe it's a little bit of both. In my life, there's certainly some things that make me happy, but too much clutter can definitely make me stressed. I think that materialism has a huge impact on life in Western culture, whether we realize it or not. We are constantly comparing ourselves to others, and most of the time it's over either beauty or possessions. For example, I might think, if only I had as much money as her, if only I could live in his house, or I wish I had his car. And I think that this type of thinking is incredibly unhealthy and that we should not attribute happiness to such objects. Therefore, I find it very admirable that the Buddha was able to decide that material possessions and comfort were not more important to him than spiritual values. And I think it is clear, at least in his case, that material possessions did not bring him true happiness or fulfillment. Moving on, the sixth deed was when the prince renounced and ordained his old life. To me, it seems like the turning point in his life was when he went for walks outside the palace. And on those walks, he saw 3 things that stood out to him in particular: an old person, a sick person, and a corpse. And this experience leads to him completely abandoning his old life and all of his luxuries. So my main question with this is, what prevents everyone else from doing this? For me, it would probably be my family. But also in Western culture, people who choose alternative lifestyles tend to be judged or looked down on, so I'd be afraid of what everyone else would think or say. I also think that the prince's motivation for this deed is particularly interesting. It seems that he felt that there was a higher form of happiness to be sought, or at least that spiritual practice could bring him happiness that he was not getting in his royal life. For the next deed, the Buddha spent 6 years of his life in austerity. And as it says here on the slide, he was attempting to conquer his desires for food, sex, and comfort. He realized, though, that physical austerities were not the way for him to achieve liberation. So one question that I've been reflecting on is if this didn't help him achieve enlightenment, then what impact did this time of his life have on his teachings and also on Buddhism in general? I think it's fairly clear to see the impact of these 6 years in the meditation practices of Buddhists. Self-discipline and strict meditation are essential to Buddhism. And also, it is fairly common for Buddhists to fast during intensive meditation. So while this period of strict austerity did not lead to enlightenment, its impact can be seen in the Buddhist principles of self-discipline and meditation. After all, Buddhism requires one to tame or train their own mind. This is a very difficult thing to do that requires much self-discipline and focus. After the 6 years of austerity, the prince decided that he would sit under a tree in India until he had reached enlightenment. He would remain there for 49 days. One thing that has intrigued me so far in this course is the importance of the number 49 in Buddhism. Besides the time the Buddha spent under the Bodhi tree, 49 also comes up again in the process of reincarnation. Interestingly, it seems that this number is also important in other major religions, such as Christianity. I also find it incredibly interesting how powerful this site continues to be in Buddhism. In a quote that I read from the first Dalai Lama, he encouraged that all who are of good family and are faithful should go to the 4 holy places for as long as they live. Bodh Gaya is the most important pilgrimage site, and tens of thousands of Buddhists make pilgrimages each year. This led me to wonder what the purpose of pilgrimage is in Buddhism. It seems to me that the idea of pilgrimage is to purify accumulated actions or maybe even karmas too. This reminded me of when we talked about saving animals from slaughter and how this could help you extend your own life. It is interesting to me how in Buddhism there is no God that will save you. Instead, you are in charge of your own path to enlightenment. Going to visit the Bodhi tree would be an example of an action you have to take yourself.
All right, so now we have the 9th deed, which is when the Buddha overcame Mara and he vanquished the host of Mara and transcended all those negative forces. So I'm not gonna go too much into like what actually occurred in the deed because I think we all have a pretty good understanding of that. Instead, I'd like to just kind of relate it back to our modern times here and to kind of discuss the modern embodiment of what Mara could be. Which to me I think it relates greatly to our modern world because it's obvious that one of his main objectives is to distract the individual away from achieving internal harmony. And we all know that distraction is very common, very rife in today's heavily digitized and modernized world. And I think that, I've had that feeling where it's like there's like some internal force pulling me towards these sources of distractions. And I feel like it's like, your mind is kind of getting kind of swept under this alluring spell and you can't even help yourself but succumb to the wishes of distractions. So that's kind of how I kind of try to relate Mara's presence in our modern world. A couple questions is why do we feel this need to be constantly entertained? And do we think it's an internal or external source of agency over this distraction? Like, are these thoughts that I'm having actually coming from my own self, my own being, or is it really an external force like Mara in my own head trying to get me constantly distracted? So there's some things to ponder as we talk about the 9th deed. All right, so moving along here to the 10th deed, which is when the Buddha reached full enlightenment by resisting the temptations of Mara, remaining in a perfect meditative state, and getting to that full enlightenment zone. So let's try to relate that back to our modern lives here on Earth. And it's kind of hard to do that because obviously none of us have the present knowledge of what achieving full enlightenment would be like. However, I think we still may be able to experience fledgling, tentative moments of complete mindfulness during our day-to-day lives. These brief interludes of supernormalcy are often described as being in the zone, or like getting this feeling, this concept of the flow into your mind as you're accomplishing a task. And they're known to arise often in situations where you're performing a task which you can find deeply intrinsically motivating. For some people, that's athletics. Ideally, in your professional lives, you'd like that to be professional work. So on a day-to-day basis, you're leaving the office maybe slightly even more fulfilled than when you walked in. But for a lot of people, that's a very difficult thing to attain. or for people like me or for other musicians, just playing the piano or playing whatever, kind of getting yourself a nice outlet to explore musically. So yeah, kind of being the zone concept. I see there in the bottom right. It's kind of a trade-off between skill and challenge. It's kind of this middle path, if you will. That's call flow. It's when your skill level is kind of matching the challenge, and as you kind of extrapolate to higher skill levels, the challenge kind of goes with that, and you start feeling this euphoria called flow. So that's kind of the concept there with 10th deed, and yeah. Swimming along here to the 11th deed here, which is when the Buddha decided to turn the wheel of Dharma with his three teachings. So there they are right there. We all know them. I'm not going to go over them too deeply. But what I'd rather focus on is can we as individuals, again, relate to this initial ability to deliver indefinite wisdom? Maybe not. But while we might not be able to presently relate to the experience of beginning, this indefinite cycle of pure knowledge and wisdom, we can certainly bask in the subsequent effects of this initial action. As you see there, we got the initial turning the wheel as your cause, and then the effect was, of course, this infinite motion of knowledge that kind of leads into this chain of effects. So we know that the importance of the first turning is that the Dharma has been in effect ever since this first turning. Now, that's why it is the first one, is because it starts this chain of events, and then thus all beings ever since then have had this constant source of knowledge from which to drink from. So leading us to the mechanic explanation for people today, they call themselves a lifelong learner. Well, that's just because now we have this indefinite cycle of knowledge that we can actually strive to attain and strive to learn for the rest of our lives and then on to the next life. Personally, I've become much more aware of this, just how much I do not know about our universe. I think it's only by accepting this reality that we don't know anything that we may strive to absorb as much wisdom as possible in your current lifetime, and then, hopefully at least have something to build off of in your next lifetime, and so on and so on, until you one day hopefully reach full enlightenment. But I know that I can't reach full enlightenment in this lifetime, but kind of being faced with this infinite depth of the Dharma motivates me to never cease our pursuit is growing as intellectual and emotionally. So that's kind of cool there. We had to kind of relate that back there. So fun. All right, and we've arrived at the 12th and the final deed here, which is when the Buddha passed into nirvana. And the first stage of that was when he was progressing through the four concentrations of the form realm. After that, he moved on to attaining equanimity. And then finally moving beyond into and then beyond the formless realms, and finally transcending samsara and passing into nirvana. So kind of this is a very vague and pretty large scale concept, of course, passing into nirvana, which most of us probably aren't really able to fully comprehend. But is there a way that we can use this concept of passing into nirvana to influence our beliefs about death? We know that in order to one gain this ability to possibly pass into nirvana, one must die in an innumerable amount of times. Thus, I think we kind of, we're forced to kind of accept this impermanence of our current physical form and kind of reflect upon this greater beauty of transcending samsara, of which the Buddha, thankfully, is already modeled for us, and we kind of go off his guidance there. Then the second question is, how does this translate back into our everyday lives? Which I think, instead of always fearing death, perhaps we may begin to accept that without its certain arrival, many aspects of our lives would hold little to no value. It's a lot to say for that. And then I think with that in mind, we can kind of gain this greater acceptance of death that is derived from the ultimate passing into nirvana, which may lead us to fully appreciate all we hold dear during our temporary existence in our current physical manifestations. So that's a very nice and very bright way to end this presentation. We want to thank you all for giving you your time, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.